It reminds me of that famous quote by Mark Twain. In the beginning of a change, the patriot is a scarce man, and brave and hated and scorned. When his cause succeeds, the timid join him, for then it costs nothing to be a patriot. On the 12th of April 1961, Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin was blasted through the atmosphere by rockets, becoming the first person to break Earth's gravity and reach space, making a complete orbital revolution of the planet before returning safely to the surface of the Earth. Does anyone really give a single fuck that 2 years later, Valentina Tereshkova basically just did the exact same thing? First person into space, parentheses, with a vagina. Sorry, but I'm not really impressed. Sir Edmund Hillary, first person to officially reach the summit of Mount Everest on the 29th of May 1953. 2 decades later, Junko Tabei became the first woman to reach the summit. Ferdinand Magellan, first person to circumnavigate the globe from 1519 to 1522. It took 2 fucking centuries for Jeannie Barrett to become the first woman to circumnavigate the globe, and that is a fairly generous statement given that she was stowed away as the botanist's assistant. She didn't do any actual navigation herself. You know, I'm not even an aviation nerd, but off the top of my head, I can name the Wright brothers, Igor Sikorsky, Chuck Yeager, and Howard Hughes. All of them men who in some way changed the face of aviation. The only famous female aviator who comes to my mind is Amelia Earhart, a woman whose great claim to fame is that she crashed and burned somewhere over the Pacific in 1937, attempting and spectacularly failing to circumnavigate the globe by air, a feat which the men of the United States Army Air Service had already achieved more than a decade earlier in 1924. 16th of July 1969. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The famous words of Neil Armstrong as he stepped from Apollo 11's Eagle landing module onto the surface of an extraterrestrial world. To this day, no woman has stepped foot on the moon ever. The typical feminist excuse is that women were institutionally prevented from competing against men in these arenas of achievement. Were they? Were women prevented from doing these things, or were they simply incapable of doing them from the outset? Discrimination does seem to serve as a very effective cover story to distract from innate inability. The insanely high mental and physical entry requirements of astronaut programs aside, to my knowledge, there was no sign at the base of Mount Everest that read "No girls allowed." So why then did a man beat women to the summit by over 2 decades? The flimsy excuse of discrimination seems to hold even less water when we move away from dangerous physical activities like space travel, circumnavigation and mountaineering to more academic pursuits. The discrimination hypothesis wouldn't, for instance, explain how in 1911, before women even had the vote, Marie Curie was able to win the Nobel Prize for Chemistry, making her not just the first woman but the first person in history to win 2 Nobel Prizes. And to this day, she remains one of only 2 people in history to have ever received the Nobel Prize for 2 completely separate fields of science, her first being the 1903 Nobel Prize for Physics. It appears to me that there has never really been an institutional barrier for women to excel in scientific fields. Science doesn't give a shit about the genitals of the researcher, it cares about testable, repeatable results. If a woman could do the research, she would be appropriately rewarded for her achievements, as was Marie Curie over a century ago. Why then are there so few notable female scientists, to the point that feminists feel the need to engage in historical revisionism, elevating women like Ada Lovelace and Rosalind Franklin far beyond their actual achievements? I have even heard of some feminists pushing this laughable accusation that Einstein plagiarized the theory of relativity from his wife. Even if you were to pretend that Marie Curie never existed and continue to push the patriarchy myth that women were historically prevented from doing science, the fact remains that women are certainly not prevented from entering science today. There is in fact a 2-to-1 female hiring bias in STEM, as well as a plethora of female-oriented affirmative action, quotas and scholarship programs. Not to mention that Western high school systems have been continuously tweaked over the last century to make it appear that girls are academically outperforming boys. This has ultimately resulted in most Western universities having a predominantly female student body. It's around 65% here in Australia. That is 2/3 female. And yet, these women dominating our Western university systems are not going into difficult STEM fields. The supposed institutional barriers that once existed are all officially gone now, but women as a demographic are still spectacularly underperforming. As a demographic, they are still not contributing in a meaningful way that helps the future success of our species. According to a study by the World Intellectual Property Organization, only 29% of patents internationally filed have at least one female inventor. Focusing on the US, that number is only about 2/3 the international average, with less than 20% of patents having at least one female inventor. Now, you'll notice this specific wording in both of these cases, quote unquote, having at least one female inventor. In other words, these numbers reflect all patents in which a female was peripherally involved in some team capacity. This report from the Institute of Women's Policy Research shows that if we only look at patents filed where the primary inventor and patent holder is female, that number drops to only 7.7%. A commenter on a previous video suggested that we couldn't entirely discount the effect of historical legacy. He argued that gender disparities haven't completely caught up yet because it's really only been the last 30 years that women have been given a fair chance. A fact that I am sure Marie Curie and her 2 Nobel Prizes would disagree with, but nonetheless, this argument is fairly unconvincing on its own when you consider the relative youth of some of these emerging STEM fields. I mean, just look at this article on Business Insider tallying the number of female systems engineers at the big tech companies. The statistics themselves are fucking pathetic, but in the context of this historical legacy argument, consider the fact that most of these companies haven't even existed for 30 years. This gaping gender discrepancy in modern tech jobs is not explained by historical prejudice in the tech industry because, frankly, the tech industry, as it were, didn't go back much past the early 80s. It is a completely new market. 30 years ago, only 20% of US households had a home computer. 20 years ago, only 10% of those households had an internet connection. People my age, the men and women of our current working generation, started off well and truly into the latter decades of second wave feminism, on exactly equal footing in terms of information technology access. And yet, according to the most recent Stack Exchange community survey, in 2017, only 7.2% of professional software developers and 8.3% of software students were female. This disparity is not because of discrimination. Like I said, Marie Curie managed to get her 2 Nobel Prizes over a century ago, and since that time, every conceivable barrier, real or imagined, has been removed, and yet women still only account for 7.7% of primary patent holders and 7.2% of professional software developers. These are not impressive statistics, especially when you consider all the affirmative action now stacked in women's favour.